one is computer targeted. And this is the one that we tend to hear a lot more about. These would be things where the actual crime has its genesis in technology. So things like hacking. Things like denial of service attacks. Virus attacks. These type of crimes couldn't be committed without the technology, could they? Pretty hard to plant a computer virus if there wasn't any computer viruses. Now, contrary to popular belief, things like identity theft. Identity theft is not really a computer-targeted crime. For the most part, it's a computer-assisted. Identity theft's been around a lot longer than computers. It just makes it easier. In some cases, however, I'll qualify that. In some cases, it makes it easier for those individuals. Just kill this. Sorry. It makes it easier for those individuals that are involved in it to get information that used to be separated, that used to be in different databases that weren't connected. It makes it easier if we turn them off. There's an example of being tied to technology. Come on. There we go. Hope it's off now. No, it's still not off. It's going to turn off eventually. So what we really have to look at is, at least, like I said, these three different categories. And really, what's common with all these categories is that it has digital evidence in it. So whether it's computer-assisted, computer-targeted, or incidental, we're dealing with digital evidence. We're going to usually have a physical crime scene and electronic or digital crime scene. Let's shift gears a bit. That's kind of the background. Let's shift gears a bit and look at this whole concept of forensics, and where we're going to go with this whole concept of what we call psychological crime scene analysis. So let's back up the bus a little bit and kind of go forensics 101. I will not call it CSI 101. Anybody says CSI gets something thrown at them. Actually, it's a little poll. Who here does not watch CSI? Oh, I like this crowd already. Really, the common element for forensics, or criminalistics, which is another fancy term for forensics, is this principle of exchange from Edmond Locard. And really what this says is when a person commits a crime, something is always left at the scene of the crime that was not present when that person arrived. You're exchanging. We commonly think of this as far as physical evidence, right? A crime scene, what do you see on the CSI shows that nobody watches? Fingerprints, right? I always want to get fingerprints. DNA. Blood samples. You might want to get footprint imprints. You might want to look at tire treads. There's all these different things that happen. You have this exchange of physical. Now, this whole concept of psychological crime scene analysis, and I'm purposely avoiding the word profiling because profiling has a very negative connotation. We've kind of moved from the days of being profiling to the days of it's now profiling is something that may be a little bit too close to the argument between is it astrology versus astronomy? Is one an art versus a science? We're going to use the concept of psychological crime scene analysis. It's profiling, but it's slightly different. And part of the principles of that is, yes, this principle of exchange that Locard has suggested is true, but it's not just true for the psychological or for the physical. It's true for the psychological. And these two other things have to happen here. The core of our personality doesn't change over time. And that's been tested, that's been researched, and for the most part, that's true. You don't wake up one day, be one type of person, and the next day be completely different. You might have peaks and valleys when you're grouchy, when you're happy, when you're sad, but for the most part, your personality after a certain age is fairly stable, is fairly set. There are some artifacts, there are some, effects of aging, but that doesn't change this drastically for our purposes. The other, as I mentioned, is the fact that this principle of exchange holds true for the psychological as well as the physical. But not only do we leave fingerprints and footprints and DNA behind, we leave a piece of our psyche behind. We leave a piece of our personality. We leave a piece of our characteristics behind. And that's the information that we're going to look at, not just in the physical, we're also going to look at that for that kind of information in the digital, because it does exist there if you know where to look for it. As I mentioned before, this whole concept of psychological profiling is really where this stuff kind of started out. And to be honest, psychological profiling is not new. It's been around for a long time. Psychological profiling Probably some of the most famous instances where Jack the Ripper. And there's a whole genre of books out there for what they call ripperologists, people who study Jack the Ripper. Who here's never heard of Jack the Ripper? Okay, good. Just before, want to make sure that we're on the same page here. Never caught, right? How many different theories are there out there who this person was? What has anybody heard? I've heard it. Some books claimed it was the Queen's doctor. Others claim it was a member of the royal family. Others have claimed that it was basically someone that owned a tannery in the area. There's multiple different profiles of who this individual was. And again, never caught. Now, the psychological profiling then is really the art and science of developing a description of a criminal's characteristics: physical, intellectual, and emotional. And it's based on the collection of evidence at the scene. Contrary to the Hollywoodization of this, it doesn't allow you to go through a room of people and say, it's him. That's the person. That is Hollywood hype. What it does do is help you reduce the potential number of suspects and provide kind of a concentration for the investigation, which in and of itself is extremely useful. If you think about it, does anybody know of any law enforcement agencies that have an unlimited amount of manpower, an unlimited budget? It doesn't exist. Those multi-billion-dollar labs with, a person who's got a PhD, each person has 9 PhDs in 9 different areas, that's Hollywood. That doesn't exist. There's a finite amount of resources, both economic and manpower, to put on one of these cases. So you haven't got time to look for everybody. You need to narrow that down. It does not replace good old-fashioned police work. It is seen as a tool, as an investigative tool. It's not a replacement. So that's the context that we need to keep in mind. A little bit of Psychology 101 here is there's actually 3 different types of profiling. You have your inductive base, your deductive base, and your hybrid. Inductive is general to the specific. This is probably the one that you're most familiar with if you've read any of the books, if you've seen any of the shows like Mindhunter, or you've seen, there's been a couple Red Dragon, Silence of the Lambs. The FBI's dichotomous model, where you've got organized and disorganized offenders. And that came about from a very long study that went out and interviewed these individuals who had been convicted of crimes, certain crimes. They interviewed them, gave them a battery of tests, put these into basically a statistical analysis, and looked at what popped out, what trends. It's really going from the general down to a specific individual that you're looking for in a case. And of course, there's issues with this because the database they used was primarily culturally constrained, which means North America, US only. And this day and age, when travel is pretty easy, there's nothing to basically jump on a plane and go to some other country. And it's really not a good idea to have a culturally biased sample to try and make, basically, you're trying to use that to extrapolate out to individuals that may or may not be from that particular culture. So, again, though, it's a model that was one of the first. You have the deductive or case-based. This is often referred to as behavioral evidence analysis. This is slightly different. This is looking at a case-by-case, basically specific to specific. It is really dealing with information, a lot of information. You basically have to get information from the people that took the pictures at the scene, the individuals that were there, the crime scene technicians. You put all this information together, and out the other end, you hope pops out a pretty good picture of who that specific individual is. Now, some of the literature claims that these are 2 mutually exclusive processes. And that's not really true. I don't know of many people that just use one and don't even bother looking at the other. For the most part, you have the hybrid approach. In the hybrid approach, you start with a large funnel. Large end of the funnel. You have multiple different possible suspects you're looking at. Quite often you use the inductive process to narrow it down to something that's a little more manageable. Once you have it narrowed down,